Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming to this panel. Thanks to the guests for joining us. It's a very distinguished panel, as Dom said. So the genesis for this panel was that there is not much in sports that is more debate-worthy than the Hall of Fame. And almost to the point where anytime a player has a great performance upon great performance that builds into a year or two of great performances, the question becomes, is he a Hall of Famer? You had it last year when Eli Manning won his second Super Bowl. You know, the entire next week, is Eli Manning a Hall of Famer? That's the question that is being asked. There's not a thought, well, if he doesn't have a second miracle pass against the Patriots, then we're not having this discussion. It is, he's won 2 Super Bowls, he's a Hall of Famer. This past fall, or this past winter, Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds, they're coming up for the Hall of Fame. There's a debate about, are they worthy of being in the Hall of Fame? And so, last winter, I'm the editor of ESPN The Magazine. We did an entire issue about what it takes to get in the Hall of Fame and how do you define what a Hall of Famer is. So the genesis for this discussion is about how can analytics make the Hall of Fame better? How can they drive who should be in the Hall of Fame? How should they help to decide who should be in the Hall of Fame? There is going to be a participatory portion of this panel beyond the Q&A. There's going to be some slides that come up, and there will be sort of nameless stats of players. And if you know who they are or have a guess of who they are, I am encouraging you, asking you, and forcing you to yell them out, and you will see what those are. I think my first question for everybody, and Buster, we'll start with you. How should analytics be influencing the Hall of Fames?
It's the backbone of the conversation. When we get our Hall of Fame ballots every year, they come on one sheet, and the first thing you do is basically go and look at the numbers. The other day, Todd Helton, it was announced that he's going to get a late start in spring training, and your first thought, to your point, was, okay, is Todd Helton a Hall of Famer? And immediately you're looking at the total number of hits he has in his career, what his numbers are at home versus on the road. And I think that goes on with every voter. I believe this, with every candidate whose name comes up, it's the first thing you go to are to look at the numbers. And more I think we look at some of the advanced metrics, in particular OPS, adjusted OPS plus, which really factors in the league and what was good in the league, and then his home road numbers.
I have a follow-up for you there, but I want Peter to answer the question also.
Well, one of the toughest things in football is, I've been a Pro Football Hall of Fame voter for 21 years, and one of the toughest things is trying to function in a system where maybe half of the players who you're considering have absolutely meaningful, comparable, verifiable statistics, and others don't. Like, for instance, I am a proponent of Joe Klecko for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He's the only defensive lineman in history to have made the Pro Bowl at defensive end, defensive tackle, and nose tackle. Well, there's no, other than to say that, I can't look at Joe Klecko's sacks and say, see, he had X number of sacks, he belongs in the Hall of Fame. I'm a proponent of a center, an old center for the Minnesota Vikings, Mick Tingelhoff, for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He played in the early 60s and into the 70s with the Minnesota Vikings. And at the time he played, just tell me if a center who played 17 years and started every preseason game, regular season game, and postseason game for the Minnesota Vikings in that time, over 350 football games, never missed. He was all-pro center, the first team all-pro center 5 times. It's as much as Mike Webster was. That's more than Dwight Stevenson was. Can't get him in the Hall of Fame. So those are the type of arguments that we have in the room and outside of the room that I have no idea what analytics can do to help Mick Tingelhoff. Can somebody go back with old grainy films and see, how well he blocked on every play? Which is really what you'd have to do to decide in an analytics way, whether, he was better, let's say for the sake of argument, than Mike Webster. So I think those are very hard. I mean, look at us. We're a bunch of doofuses. We had a hard enough time getting Chris Carter in the Hall of Fame. Took him 5 years, and he caught 1,100 balls and was probably the best boundary receiver of all time. So, look, it's an extremely difficult thing. I want to use analytics absolutely as much as possible, but it's fairly difficult in football.
Dean?
Yeah, it is. I'm working on football a lot these days, working on basketball historically, and certainly following all the Bill James work on baseball for many years. It is interesting, the conversations that have come up. There's a lot of conversations, what you're talking about. Were you the best at your position? Were you the best in the game? A lot of times based upon not what we would call analytics so much, but the way people voted, because that is what is available. Now, can we improve upon that? Certainly. You can. Analytics, in my mind, is relating a player's productions to the wins of the team. And that is productivity. That's the question you have to face when you are on a team. And that's a sports story. But it's the Hall of Fame. And sometimes fame isn't necessarily about the winning. It is, are you famous for one skill? Are you famous for some element of the game? And I think that's a fair question. Just to mention, I did go to the Basketball Hall of Fame on my way here on this trip, and I talked to the president of the Basketball Hall of Fame, and I asked him some of these questions, and he says those criteria really are left to the people in the room making those discussions. How should we bring in the numbers? How much do we trust them? And so I think it is an open question, and I think it will evolve. As the numbers become more prevalent, more advanced, more available, they will find their ways into these arguments to very different degrees.
Can I follow up? I always felt as a baseball reporter, I covered the NFL for 1 year, 2002, covered the Giants for the New York Times, and after coming from covering baseball for 15 years, you suddenly felt like, wow, how can I say that this lineman's really good? Other than just essentially just making an empty statement, because in baseball, you can back up everything with numbers. There are 1,000 numbers. There's no sport which has more numbers, which is why I think there's so much focus on the Baseball Hall of Fame, because people love the numbers. They know what 755 is and what 714 and what 56. All those numbers have a meaning that I don't think are attached the way they are in football. So I always felt fortunate.
I think one of the things that happened this year that I was thrilled with is that two offensive linemen, Larry Allen and Jonathan Ogden, made it. And my whole attitude, because the membership in that room, we've got 46 voters, and I think I've been in there the fourth longest of anybody, or maybe third. But one of the points that, as we were leading up to the meeting, that I told quite a few of the younger voters, is that, look, you've seen, I bet you have covered 15 games of the Baltimore Ravens over the last 15 years. You've seen Jonathan Ogden play. You've seen him, as that new kind of basketball player, power forward, nimble-footed left tackle who can just push everybody out of the way, which is a new way of playing left tackle, really, over the last 2 decades. You've seen Larry Allen be an absolute road grader for Emmitt Smith and everything. I mean, you've watched this. So don't feel like you have to rely on listening to what other people say, because I think a lot of times in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, one of the things that we have to do as the voters is we have to trust our eyes. You can bring out every statistic in the world that you want. I happen to think, whatever you would say, in my mind, there is absolutely no question in my mind that Chris Carter's a more deserving Hall of Famer than Andre Reed or Tim Brown. Period. That's just what I say. I've seen them all play. I've seen them play a lot. I know their importance to their teams. I know individually what they do really well. It's not that I'm demeaning those other guys, but I just truly believe that this one guy stood above the other ones. And it isn't that I wouldn't vote for the other ones, but I think too often, we're looking for sort of the quantitative reason to vote for somebody for the Hall of Fame, where in the sport of football, it's just different than baseball and basketball, I think, and probably different than hockey too.
Well, that's the next part of the question, is because the Pro Football Hall of Fame is so subjective. So when you guys are in the room having the conversation, how much of it becomes what you're talking about, I've seen it with my eyes, and how much of an influence do the actual numbers have in the final conversation about a particular player?
Well, I don't think the numbers in any way have ever been the be-all, end-all. Maybe except for Warren Moon in recent years. I just don't think the numbers have totally told the story. Maybe except for Warren Moon and Curtis Martin. But I think it's more and more, as I've been on that committee, I think it's more and more you go by what you see, and you go by what the people, like for instance, you know, we all talk to coaches and general managers during the course of the year, and we'll say, you know, like my question to a lot of people, going back to training camp, as I would go through camp, if I'd be alone with a guy like a veteran, you know, defensive coordinator, let's say, I'd say, okay, I wouldn't tell him what I thought. I said, okay, you know, Chris Carter, Andre Reed, Tim Brown, put them in order for me, 1 through 3. And even though I knew how I felt, I just wanted to hear how they felt. If a bunch of people, you know, 10 in a row had said, oh, Andre Reed is kill those guys. Yeah, I'd rather have him in a heartbeat. Or, you know, and I would ask them, I mean, you know, about pass rushers. You know, Michael Strahan, Kevin Green, Charles Haley, put them in order for me. You know, and so those are the kind of things where I will use others' opinions to help sculpt mine slightly, but I never let it be the be-all, end-all, because for most of these guys who are in the room right now, you know, I mean, I've covered the NFL for 29 years. I've seen them a lot, and I have a pretty good opinion. Now, I always make sure that I have an open mind going into the room, because I got to tell you, the year that Warren Moon was up, I didn't think there was a chance I was going to vote for him. But I thought the presentation by a guy named John McClain from the Houston Chronicle was so thorough and so good and answered a lot of my doubts about him. It's not that I didn't think absolutely that he wasn't Hall of Famer. I just liked other people better going into the meeting that year. And that's one of the other things. I don't mean to monopolize this chat. I'll shut up in a second. But that's one of the other things about our deal. You know, Buster can vote for 10 guys on his ballot if he wants. You know, we can vote maximum 5 of the 15 modern era finalists in every year. Everybody says, my God, how can you not vote for Charles Haley? I did. I voted for Charles Haley every year. The fact is, when it comes down to the final 5, the way it works, then you have to vote yay or nay on the final 5. But if I vote for a guy on the cut down from 10 to 5, like this year I voted for Aeneas Williams. I love Aeneas Williams. Aeneas Williams absolutely, unequivocally is a Hall of Fame football player. And I just hope that one, as in my opinion, is Charles Haley. But you just have to, I hate to say you have to wait your turn, but you know, if you think about pro football and what is the ultimate unfairness of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, it's this. There's 32 teams in the NFL. There's 22 starters. I think there's 30 teams in baseball. There's 9 starters every day, plus however many pitchers you would count. But there's far more people in pro football that you would have to consider. Plus their careers are most often shorter in pro football than they are in baseball. But there's so many more people to consider in pro football than there are in these other sports that it just makes it very difficult when you have to cut it down from 10 guys, 9 of whom you might feel are deserving, to the best 5 that you can pick.
Football is so different than baseball because the Saturday of the Super Bowl and you guys are all in a room and you're having a conversation and you're making presentations and there's a very debate-oriented process to the way you guys decide it, whereas in baseball, you're on your own with your ballot. So I have a 2-part question. One is, how much are you discussing with other people? And then the second part is, how much forget about the regular stats, you know, how much, you talked about advanced metrics a little bit, how much are advanced analytics playing more of a role in the decisions you're making, and is that a part of the conversation you're having?
There's no question that advanced analytics are having a greater role in the conversation. You think about in the last few years, there's been a lot of conversation about, in particular, the candidacy of Jack Morris. He's become, for I think sabermetricians, almost a target. You know, the guy that they don't think is worthy of the conversation, they don't think he should bring in. Peter, you mentioned about the way that you talk to people in the sport, and you ask them, what do you think? When you talk to people from the 1980s and ask that question, who is the man among pitching staff? They go, oh, Jack Morris, no question. And that's the feeling of the people who play the game at that time. Whereas when you look
think
at
that should count. I really do.
I do to an extent as well, and I vote for Jack Morris. I'll give you another example.
What's the reason he doesn't get in? I'm not familiar.
It essentially is a 3.90 ERA, high ERA, some of those particular numbers like that. But I'll give you another one. Jim Rice and Andre Dawson are two guys who I think the sabermetric community, they basically don't think those two are worthy of being in the Hall of Fame. But I voted for both those players in part because of the context of the times. And I'll give you an example. When Eddie Murray played with the Baltimore Orioles, he thought it was his job to drive in runs. He quantified, he evaluated himself based on RBI. And there's no question when you look at the salaries, the guys who had RBI were the guys who were paid. Jim Rice was paid, Andre Dawson was paid. So within the sport, it was viewed as the job of a Jim Rice, of an Andre Dawson to drive in runs. They didn't want them taking walks. If you read the book on Ted Williams by Lee Montville, there's a part in there where Ted Williams was viewed as being selfish because he took walks. Well, the way the game has evolved now, and the way that it's evaluated statistically, it's clear there's been a dramatic shift where people now want players to take walks, want players to get on base. So while the sabermetric community would say, you know, a Dawson, a Rice are not worthy, in the time they played, that's how the game was played, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. So I'll evaluate something like that, which is why I voted for them. And on the other hand, you do take the advanced metrics. You know, you look at the players within the context of their times. You know, a guy like Jeff Kent, for example, who you don't necessarily think of as being a Hall of Famer, but then when you look at the advanced metrics, it's pretty clear he is a Hall of Famer.
Plus, he was really good on Survivor. Well, when did that start? When did that start to become something that?
Oh, Moneyball, no question.
Was it
Moneyball, yeah. Now the sport is everything is quantified, and I almost feel, as I mentioned to you before, Peter, you almost, when you say a statement like, "I think that guy's a really good defensive outfielder," you have now a reflex. You're like, "Boy, I better get two numbers to back it up," because you don't want to get into in baseball. You better have something to support it. The other day, I ran a piece on the feeling in baseball that it's not worth it for a catcher to block home plate to save one run in one game over 162-game season. So I called a really smart general manager, and I said, what is the value of a one run being saved by blocking home plate versus the overall value of the player? Because among the general managers in the sport, they think the idea of blocking the plate with a valued catcher is stupid. It's insane. But in uniform personnel, there's an expectation that, well, that's the game, the way the game has been played. So the general manager got back to me, and the number that they generated within their front office was the value of saving one run, potentially by blocking the plate, would be about $250,000. Buster Posey was worth $36 million to the Giants last year. So, yeah, a third of the teams have gone to their catchers privately and say, don't block the plate, Sparky, because it ain't worth it to us. And now there's no question that that's, it absolutely is now ingrained. That sort of thinking is, I think, is ingrained probably in about 90% of the front offices. And I think the writers, for the most part.
And the writers, from the Hall of Fame perspective, that's what matters.
No doubt. And you know, Tim Kirkjian talks about his process being about spending an hour on each candidate. I don't go that far. But I know that's how far, how deep Tim goes into it. And I don't think there's any question that the Baseball Hall of Fame is probably debated more than any other Hall of Fame because, as I say, fans are wed to the numbers. They absolutely are invested in the numbers, whether it's Jack Morris's 3.90 ERA and whether or not that's worthy, or you know, how many, you know, Jeff Kent's OPS relative to other second basemen of his time.
All right, so I want to bring up one of the graphics that we're going to show. The first one it's a graphic from the
There's one of-
magazine. Is it over here? All right, so this was a project that, Peter, it's over there, guys. This was a project, this
baseball.
was from the Hall of Fame issue, and this was a project that we did in conjunction with ESPN.com, where we basically remade the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame based on a variety of statistics, WAR being paramount among them. And so Buster was one of the voters, and the premise is that you can only have 100 people in the Hall of Fame, and every year it's a rotation, and people get in and people get out, and so Buster was one of the people who voted for the 100 people who deserve to be in, and WAR was a part of that conversation. So I just wanted you to take us a little bit through your process and how you were using analytics when you were making these decisions.
Yeah, I think that, as we've talked about, looking at WAR, looking at adjusted OPS plus, which to me is really valuable because it puts into context what the players are doing at that time, and those to me are the most important numbers. It's part of the reason why, when I look at the top 100, I can't believe Joe Jackson didn't make it in. He ranks tied for 7th all time in adjusted OPS plus. I know he didn't have career numbers because he was suspended, but when you look at his overall production, it's crazy. And I'll give you another number that shocked me, and I know that typically the sabermetric community doesn't value relievers very highly. Mariano Rivera's performance is so incredibly off the charts that when he didn't make it the top 25, I was shocked. When you think about...
Did he make it in the 100?
Yes, he was something around 43, 44.
He was in there. He was one of the few. There weren't many relievers. I think he might have been the only one.
Dennis Eckersley was out of it. Yeah, he
Yep.
was number one. But when you look at, and to go back to what Peter was saying about having conversations with people in the game, I can tell you there are probably a half dozen members of the Atlanta Braves that I've spoken with over the years who absolutely believe that if Rivera had been the Braves closer instead of the Yankees closer, it would have been the Braves that won 4 championships in 5 years. I agree with you. I think there's some value in that. And when you look at what he did in the postseason, Mariano Rivera has a career ERA of 0.70, 141 innings. That's 2 seasons for a reliever. He has allowed a total of 2 home runs. That's crazy. So for me, when you look at him being so much better than anybody else in the postseason, I would put him higher up in that top 25. Adjusted OPS plus, I think he's 60 points better, 50 points better than any other pitcher in the history of baseball.
It'd be 069 if he didn't let Dave Roberts steal second base.
Says the Red Sox fan. So, Dean, when you hear a conversation like this about sort of the stats in baseball, NBA, professional basketball, and you've worked for teams, is much closer to sort of having an ability to baseline everything than the NFL is. Do you think there is an opportunity for professional basketball to build a process like this and have it become much more influential?
I think we're heading towards the baseball route. I think it's a ways away. We don't have the money ball of basketball, even though there's so many NBA teams here and it's integrated. We don't have the public perception, and there's definitely still more of a distrust, and the process is different. The process for getting people in is not the writers as much. It's a bunch of it's former Hall of Fame players and people who know the game and those.
As opposed to the writers.
Yeah, well, but you have people in the NBA beat. They come in and out sometimes. So, but the numbers are there. You have WAR and win shares effectively are the same thing as WAR. So we have a number that's comparable to that, but it's not as well accepted. But it will be part of the conversations going forward. If you're starting to look at the players from the perspective of analytics, that is the most basic one that you would apply for a Hall of Fame player, is how many wins are they contributing. It summarizes the points, the rebounds, the assists that they use as shortcuts to try to get at quality. The win shares is essentially that, and I think it will be a much more prominent part of those discussions as the group of people who make these decisions see the progress of this.
Dude, you're jumping ahead because that win shares graphic isn't for
coming
2
up.
more slides.
Yep.
So we can't really talk about that yet. But, because I want to go back to Peter for a second, because as a baseball fan who is also an NFL Hall of Fame voter, when you hear Buster talking about this, do you think, God, I wish there was a way to be more objective about a Chris Carter, Andre Reed, Tim Brown debate? Or do you wish there was someone who was going back and doing the study to find out how many pancakes Mick Tingelhoff had, or how often he allowed sacks in
I
those
mean,
17 years?
I'd love to be able to have more of an analytical view on Mick Tingelhoff. Maybe it'd show that, because the cliche on Tingelhoff is that he got beat up in 2 Super Bowls, and that's why he's not in the Hall of Fame. I mean, you know, maybe that's true, but I think the way football is a little bit different. If I told you that a player for the Minnesota Vikings, a team that played outdoors, you know, for this guy's career, if I told you that a player for the Minnesota Vikings, an interior lineman, started every game, over 350 straight games, preseason, regular season, postseason, and was all pro as much as Mike Webster, more than Dwight Stevenson, more than Dermontti Dawson, all Hall of Famers. I mean, you know, I hate to say it, because, I mean, to me, I think of Mick Tingelhoff sort of as Carl Yastrzemski. He showed up every day. He played every day. He left it all on the field every day, you know. And obviously it's different, football and baseball. But how about playing outside in Minnesota every day for 17 years? You start in the, you know, 85-degree humidity of August.
I think what would be nice, though, about some of the football analytics is to add more to that story. And that's, I think, we are doing this. We are trying to look at the
But the
analytics
question
of
is,
an
I think
offensive lineman.
but I think it's impossible, because I don't think film and or video exists for every game going back to 1962, when Mick Tingelhoff began his career. Certainly not for for every snap, so that you could watch how the center performed.
Well, and there's so many variables in football too.
There are.
That with baseball, it's one-on-one. It's a pitcher
Yeah.
versus the hitter. You can quantify things very specifically.
Yeah.
Whereas in football, Tingelhoff might, you know, maybe he doesn't execute his block, but that might not necessarily be
His fault.
correct.
Yeah, and I mean, we talk about that with corners all the time. When you watch a football game, it's hard to tell very often whose fault it was on a deep pass play. You know, I was just watching some tape last week. I was writing a little bit for Sports Illustrated about a cornerback from Florida State named Xavier Rhodes. I don't watch much college football at all during the season. And so in the postseason, then I'll go onto YouTube or wherever I can, and I'll start watching. So I was watching 30 or 40 plays of Xavier Rhodes, and there was a play where he gave up a touchdown pass, it looked like to me, to this guy from Clemson, DeAndre Hopkins. And so when he gave it up, I had to watch it 4 or 5 times. I still can't tell whether he was handing him off to the safety because the safety didn't automatically come over, or whether he was just lazy and he gave up, and it was his fault that they gave up the 58-yard touchdown.
So
or
how does
whatever
that
it
go
was.
into your evaluation?
I don't know.
And
I
think
wasn't able to. It's something that I truly would have to ask a coach.
And I think
You
we
know?
can do that with the analytics side too. Is if you don't know, you don't have to include it necessarily in there.
Right.
And I think that would be.
But
the
it's
goal
so
that I would
valuable because it's 2 potential first-round guys. I want to know. I want to know the answer to that.
Oh, I would
So
wanna
it's one
know
of
as
those.
well.
It's one of those things that I mean, in an ideal world, I would pick up the phone and try. I don't know who. You know, I don't even know any of the coaches at Florida State. But I mean, I would try to find out whose fault it was. But you know, the bottom line in this is, I think, especially with the old timers, I'm not saying it's impossible. I just think it's highly, highly unlikely that you would be able to provide analytics to show whether Mick Tingelhoff was a better player than Mike Webster.
I think we can make progress. I'm a little more hopeful.
Dean is going to.
But how would you do
I
it?
think you're right. Going back a long way is difficult. I think already
What exists in 1962? And I ask this question because I don't know.
I know there's some tape, and you don't need every game. You're talking about the value of a lot of snaps. I agree, but There are people who don't watch every snap, and they will evaluate this working.
Well,
in
I
the
know
league,
that. I know
and they'll
that.
say,
But what
yeah,
I'm saying,
make that judgment.
what I'm saying, I guess, is I wonder how you can find enough snaps to make an intelligent decision. I think you could probably find most, if not all, of Mike Webster's snaps, because his first year was 1974. I just can't believe that every Mick Tingelhoff snap from 1962 to whatever, 79, whatever his last year was. Just hard for me to believe that every one of those exists, or even even a half of them. I would be surprised if they exist. But
But
who
if you
knows?
get,
Maybe
if
they
you get
do.
half, and you have some metric that
Yeah,
says
maybe
Joe
it is.
Giglio's in the
I
top
have no
3,
idea how
if
many
you-
exist.
Yeah, if just hypothetically.
But then what you would have to do is you'd have to do it for everybody else in his era. You know?
That's what I was saying. It's
It
a
is
lot of
a
effort.
monstrous, monstrous, ridiculous process. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I just think it's a little bit unrealistic to think it could be.
I
Who
think to
knows?
do it from the perspective of analytics and data is also difficult too, because that's not necessarily digitally available. I agree that it is very difficult.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of the word impossible myself.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
All right, I want to bring up the next graphic, which is, you guys will see it over there. No, that's not it. But
Way
we
to
can-
go,
We
Chad.
can do that one if you want to.
What is this one?
I think that's the NBA one. All right, so that's the NBA one, and all of these stats
these
should
are
be coming
stats.
up. There we go. So who can guess who this person is?
Not me.
Anybody want to take a shot? Because it is someone who is considered to be Hall of Fame worthy, and it would surprise you. Who said? Karolenko? Who else? Drexler?
Greg Kite.
Greg
No.
Kite? Scottie Pippen? The answer is Tracy McGrady.
Very good player.
And so
Very good player.
Dean was part of a project where he worked on reimagining what an NBA Hall of Fame would look like if you only based it on what he was talking about, a formula that involved what he was talking about called win shares, and equated that into a dominance rating, which became a Hall of Fame rating. And so, is there an argument to be made that Halls of Fame, when possible, should be decided by a dominance Hall of Fame rating?
So yeah, the concept behind this is one that I guess I stole. Bill James had this concept that you evaluate players based upon some series of their best years. Because if you have people who stick around and they're good for a long, long time, they can rack up a lot of wins, a lot of win shares towards a team. But were they ever the best? And that we have this instinctive belief that you should have been the best, at least at your position or in the top couple. And where you do have guys, and I think in the NBA you have guys like Terry Porter, Buck Williams, these guys who had very long careers. Were they ever the best? Were they ever the top couple? People would argue against it. But the concept is maybe you look at their top 5 best years. And that gives you some sort of evaluation of the dominance that they had over some period of time. And that's relevant. And so what we did look at was, yeah, their total, and we added in essentially a dominance factor based upon how good were they in their best 5 years. There's other ways to incorporate this, and who knows whether it should be 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. There's some arbitrariness to that. But it gets at that aspect of the question. Mick Tingelhoff playing as long as how great was he? Well, yeah, he was an all-pro multiple years. And so you want to capture that. If it was that long a career, but he'd never been an all-pro, would your argument be the same? It would be a little more difficult, whether you make it as well. And so that's what we tried to incorporate. And I think it is.
I wouldn't be making the argument if he played 17 years and started every game and was never all pro, or, I wouldn't make it.
Right.
But the fact that 5 times, he was selected as the best center in the NFL really, I think, is a tremendous injustice that he's not in,
And
given the incredible longevity at a position where you're getting stepped on and kneed in the groin 5 times a game, you know?
I
So,
wonder if we measured that.
yeah.
Was it 5 years in a row that he was All-Pro?
I don't know. I don't know.
think it was.
You know, there was
I don't
a
think it was.
similar type thing. You mentioned the dominance factor. One of the most interesting guys in the Baseball Hall of Fame ballot in recent years was Burt Blyleven, who the sabermetric community absolutely strongly believed that he was for sure a Hall of Famer. I didn't vote for him, and here was my question, was to the dominance. Was there ever a period where he was clearly one of the 3 or 4 best guys in his league? If you go back and look at his history of when he became a free agent, he wasn't the most sought-after guy. If you look at the trades that were made during his career, it wasn't like this huge, massive return like we saw with the Vida Blue. And I went to I want to say about 15 to 20 players that era, and I said, here's my quandary with Blyleven. Clearly was a really good pitcher for a long time. But were there times when you thought of him as being one of the most dominant guys in the game, including guys in the Twins I talked to who he played with, and they were like, no. You know, that they actually thought of guys like Jack Morris does have that. When you go to guys who played, they thought of Jack Morris as the man. And they're the ones in the box. They're the ones who are playing in those games. And I agree with you. I think there's something to that, and that has to count for something.
Analytically, I'm curious what Jack Morris, whether his best years, I haven't looked at him as much, whether his best years were really good. Because I know.
Well, I think certainly when you look at the advanced analytics, they're not dominant.
They're not.
And one of the big, Jack Morris is right at the center of one of the big arguments about pitching according to the score. And the sabermetric community believes that there's no evidence that anyone pitches to the score. Well, I can tell you flat out that they do. And it was 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with Jim Palmer about this. He was down in Orioles camp, and I said that all the statistics that are used to dismiss the idea that people are pitching to the score are completely irrelevant because it might only happen for 2 or 3 pitches in a game. And the only way to get to that statistic is to go to the catcher and the pitcher and ask them, when did you basically decide, you know what, here you go. I'm just going to throw you a fastball because it's 5-1 and I'm behind in the count 2-0 and I don't want to walk you. And you can't get to that number unless you talk to the players involved. It does happen. You know, we actually, during the on Sunday Night Baseball, Bobby Valentine and Oral Hershiser were in our meeting, and Bobby was saying, well, the composition of the lineup doesn't matter, and Oral just burst out laughing. He was like, are you kidding me? I'm always looking at the guy in the on-deck circle, and if the count's 2-0, and I want to pitch to that guy, then I'm throwing a breaking ball. And if I don't want to face that guy, I'm throwing a fastball. And those decisions, as I say, they may only involve 4 or 5 pitches per game. So the idea that that's not a factor, that Jack Morris couldn't potentially pitch the score, I'm sorry, but if you talk to players, it's clear they constantly make those choices during the course of a game.
I think we have some people at ESPN who might be able to look at that. That would be a good one. Because that's a great question. It can be quantified.
No, it can't, though. You can't quantify it unless you talk to the players and know exactly when the concession pitch was made or when the breaking ball was made.
But you know what, to me, that's way TMI for the Hall of Fame. I mean, come on. Come on.
Well, that's a
way,
lot of what Jack Morris.
Way too much.
But this is a lot of what Jack Morris's candidacy is hinging on, where people say, "Well,
then he doesn't belong." Then he doesn't belong. I don't know. I have no idea if he belongs. But if we're trying to decide what pitch he's throwing when he's down 5-1 or up 5-1, I don't know. Either you're a Hall of Famer. I sound really like an old man. Get off my lawn. But come on, that's ridiculous to me.
Well, that's the argument to be made for having analytics be the baseline and making this a completely objective process. And so then you're not even you're
I don't think it should be that way.
What is the most fun part of sort of the conversation?
I don't think it should be that way. I mean,
debate.
you've got to, at some point, you have to take into account the kind of competitor a guy was. Whether, you guys had the Hall of Fame issue with Eli Manning, and this is one of the things that drives me absolutely crazy about fans, and quite honestly, the media a lot of times. You know, when I was told that this quarterback in his 8th or 9th year, because he'd won 2 Super Bowls and did so well at the end of these 2 Super Bowls, that now he absolutely had to be a Hall of Famer. Why? I don't have to decide on Eli Manning for another, I'll probably be dead by the time Eli Manning's name comes up, but I almost certainly won't be on the Hall of Fame committee. I mean, you know, he's going to play another, let's say 8 years at least, and then it's 6 years after that before he can go in. We're 14 years away from sitting in judgment of Eli Manning, and everybody wants to know, is he a Hall of Famer? I don't know. I'll tell you in 14 years. I can't tell you now. But I mean, the fact is that if a guy in 3 consecutive games against the New England Patriots, 2 of them Super Bowls and 1 of them in Foxborough, had the ball in his hands at the 2-minute warning of the 4th quarter, behind, and led his team to a touchdown all 3 times, and the Giants won every one of those games in regulation, that would lead me to beating Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. That would certainly lead me to believe that 2 of them Super Bowls, it's very likely he's going to be in the Hall of Fame one day. But
He sounds like the Jack Morris of football.
That's not
Well,
a bad comparison.
a lot of people would say to people who have played very well in big moments, like, I get it all the time. Every time I've been to Oakland in the last few years, why haven't you put Plunkett in the Hall of Fame? Have you seen his stats? I mean, I know that playing well in big games has to count, but is a big part of it. But gee whiz,
Can't
it's
blown out of proportion.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. You know, Jim Plunkett is not a Hall of Famer. He's not even barely in the Hall of Very Good. But I think that is the thing, in my opinion, that is the most frustrating thing about the Hall of Fame. Everybody wants an answer now when a guy's 28 years old and has 8 years left to play. What if Eli Manning stinks the next 8 years? I don't know. I mean, maybe he'll undo a lot of the good that he did. I can't tell you. Let's let the career play out. Let's let him play. He's halfway done with his career. Can we please just let him play, and then we'll decide at the end of that?
You've never been on Twitter, have you?
No.
Boy.
That's the bane of my existence around the Hall of Fame time every year. It's everybody saying, I'm outraged that you didn't put in John Doe in the Hall of Fame. I mean, well, okay, be outraged.
So we're going to go to some questions from the audience right now. And this is an interesting one. How do you value character and other intangibles with or against the modern metrics? Let's start with Buster.
For the Hall of Fame, I basically threw out the character clause. I mean, I guess if we go right to that, the whole steroid question, I don't even consider it because there's no evidence that the character clause was ever used by Hall of Fame voters in the past. They let in guys who used PEDs in the past. They let in racists. They let in, Ty Cobb notoriously went in the stands, beat somebody up. Gaylord Perry admitted that he cheated throughout his career, wrote a book about it. He got in. There's no evidence that the character clause was ever, in fact, the guy who was thought to have written the character clause was Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Was the commissioner of baseball. He worked through 1944 to keep blacks out of baseball, okay? So the guy who wrote the character clause. So there's no evidence that up until Mark McGuire's name hit the ballot that the character clause was ever used as a tipping point for keeping a guy in or out. So I just throw it out and I just look at the context of times. That's why I voted for Bonds, I voted for Clemens, voted for players that era. I'm going to look at it differently for guys who were suspended after 2006, which is when I think baseball first got serious about its drug testing.
We can't consider if somebody's a turd. We're told that the only factors that count are the factors that contribute to what happens on the field between the white lines. There's only one thing that I believe, that I would consider a, quote, locker room attribute, unquote, and that is, sort of what I would call leadership. And I've brought it up one time in a very adamant way. I thought that on the Cowboys teams of the 1990s that Michael Irvin was a vastly more important character person, leader person, help that team far more than anybody else on the team, or other than Jimmy Johnson, any coach.
Are drug issues an issue in the room for?
Well, no, they can't be. The only way that they can be is if you measure how many games a guy missed because of it. But the one thing that is an issue and should be an issue is that if he was either a steroid or performance-enhancing drug thing, which we really haven't had, whatever you'd call kind of the Sean Merriman clause, or to argue about him. Not that he'll ever get in the room, but I think the one thing about all that is the only way I think you can really consider it is if you consider how much time the guy missed and whether he was a multiple offender. Then I think it would be hard to vote for a guy like that. But in general, you're supposed to only consider what happens between the lines.
That's similar in basketball too. That's what I was told, is that, yeah, for the most part, it's what happens to the game. Are you a good representative of the game? If you do something, gamble against your own team while you're playing or something like that, yeah, that's outside the lines, but it's besmirching the game. But yeah, I was told that things that happened maybe after you were retired, you had domestic assaults or something like this, that's not supposed to be considered in general.
Like I would vote right now, if I had a vote, I would vote for O.J. Simpson. I wouldn't even think twice. He's one of the 5 greatest running backs who ever played. I just don't care what happened to him after his career. Now, socially I care. As a citizen I care. But as a Hall of Fame voter, I can't care.
I'm clearly, and just to make it clear, I'm clearly in the minority on my view on the character clause.
But you know what? If I voted for the Baseball Hall of Fame, I'd feel the same way as you did, because you're supposed to. There is a character. You're allowed to consider character in baseball.
You're allowed, but I don't. In view of the steroid issue, as I say, I went back and looked and see how much the character clause affected past votes. But on top of that, I mean, when I first started covering baseball in 1989, covering AAA, it was people within the sport already knew that there were steroids in the game, and that went on for 15 years, and nobody said a word. And then suddenly, after the 2005 hearing in Congress, that suddenly became part of the conversation, and there was this incredible retroactive morality that has been applied by the baseball writers, in my opinion, which I think you have to look at the context of the times. I'm going to draw an analogy that's probably not fully appropriate. I mean, Thomas Jefferson is one of the guys on Mount Rushmore, okay? He also was a slave owner. That was his time. When he was president, that was the context of the times. When Bonds, Clemens, all these guys were playing baseball, the sport was saturated with performance-enhancing drug use, and nobody did a thing about it. And that's why I have a hard time after the fact where people say, oh, Mark McGwire was evil. Well, you don't see the Cardinals giving their checks back. You don't see Bud Selig giving the checks back. I always tell people, I think Selig's numbers are based as much on performance-enhancing drugs as Clemens' numbers were.
I want to. I have a bunch of questions here from the audience, but if people have questions and they didn't get them in and they want to stand up or raise their hand, they're more than welcome to. Should the Sports Writers Association certify voters on a regular basis to ensure that voters cover the sport and are up to date? Buster, you start.
I don't know how you do that. Speaking of subjectivity, I mean, what would the test for that be? I do think that my own opinion is that the baseball writers should not be voting on the Hall of Fame. I don't think we should be involved in the process. I think they should come up with a different process. I felt all along it's not my job to dictate legacies, and I feel like that the vote should reflect legacies, and it's clear by the way the voting's gone that that's not what's happening.
Dean, you were shaking your head when I asked the question.
Well, I mean, tend to agree. You don't want to certify. That's all these certifications of who's an expert. That makes it really hard. You gotta. Hopefully, they self-select. And you're going to have some people who are just may not be as knowledgeable as the others, but as you have a big enough group, you're going to be fine, I think.
Peter?
It's a little bit different in football because the Pro Football Hall of Fame, I think rightfully so, says we want one media representative from every NFL playing city. So, and they have 2 from New York, and then the rest of them are at-large voters. So a lot of times it's patently obvious in Jacksonville, there's only one paper that covers the team, and then there's a couple of TV stations. So it really isn't that big a pool to choose from. And there are other cities where there are a lot. But, I mean, the Hall of Fame, the minute you do not cover your team anymore, like that year, though, I mean, there was 3 new guys, 1 woman, I think, and 2 guys that came in this year. And so, you know, I think, look, I don't know. I know the debate about the composition of the people who vote, and I know that many players have an incredible low amount of respect for the voting panel, but it's what I always say to people. I'm not going to say the names involved here, but there was a borderline Hall of Famer that came up about 10 years ago, and one of the guys in the room stood up and gave a stirring, heartfelt testimonial from a player who played against this guy for years. And I happen to know that these 2 guys were partners in a business after football and how close they were as friends. How can I trust that? I don't care what this guy says about his buddy. I mean, my whole point is that I think that in some ways, I think players would be as dangerous as having, or more dangerous really, than having writers do it.
Yeah.
And if you were going to have, say, a player who's a former Cleveland Brown, then you would have to have a former Pittsburgh Steeler. And if you're going to have a former Dallas Cowboy, you have to have a former Philadelphia Eagle. So that adds 32 people to the room right away. So now we're talking about there's 78 people in there. The thing this year took 8 hours and 7 minutes. And I'm all in favor of, I'll stay there till midnight. I don't care. You know, however long we debate, that's how long we debate. We're 57 minutes this year on Bill Parcells. I said to the guy next to me, I said, if it's an hour and 57 minutes, great. It means that people have a lot of things they want to argue about. So that's wonderful. But I do think that, and I don't even know what the hell I'm talking about now. I don't even know what the question was. But what I'm going to say, what I was saying is that I think the problem, when you look at it from the outside, there's always a better way. And I'm totally open to any way anybody wants to do it. I'm totally open to getting kicked off. It's okay with me. But I do think that there's a reason why it is the way it is right now that isn't just patently absurd.
Is there an advantage to being on the docket earlier in the day versus later in the day?
A lot of people have said that. And like this year, I'm trying to remember, I think Will Shields was one of the last guys, and he only got like maybe 6 minutes, and everybody else had gotten more. But the one thing I said, and I mean defensive linemen were late, and Strahan didn't get as long a time as like Sapp or something. But the one thing I say is that, and I'm just speaking for myself, and you know, this is a little bit inside the thing, but you know, Will Shields is definitely, in my opinion, a Hall of Fame football player. I just determined I wouldn't have cared if we talked about it for an hour and 15 minutes. You know, that this year, in my opinion, there were 2 better linemen in the room, and there were then 3 other people among the modern era finalists who were better than Will Shields. That doesn't mean I don't think he's a Hall of Famer. I absolutely think he is a Hall of Famer. You just can't put everybody in at once. But that's a very good question, and it's one of the reasons why they change that every year about the position groups going first and everything like that. I don't think it's a big deal. It isn't to me anyway. And it isn't, a lot of people say, well, if some guy is talked about at 9:05 in the morning and the bar is set really high, then nobody's going to beat him. And I said, well, that's kind of silly, because a lot of times, you know, at 4 in the afternoon, you forget what was said at 9 in the morning, and the guy at 4 in the afternoon sounds fantastic. So, you know, you can look at it a lot of different ways, but I don't really think it's that big a deal about who goes first and who goes last.
We have time for one more question. I saw your hand first, so.
First of all, thank you guys so much for coming. In terms of the Baseball Hall of Fame in the 80s and 70s players that a lot of sabermetricians have a problem with being elected, I think the reason a lot of sabermetricians have a problem with it is that people have a feeling that we have to have a certain number of people elected from every era. Basically, like the best players from every era should be elected, ignoring the fact that certain eras have like different distributions of greatness. In the 70s and 80s, there weren't that many great players, there was definitely like a fatter, narrower tail of distribution of greatness. Whereas in the modern era, there's a lot of really great players like James Berkeley who might get shut out just because there are other guys who are better than him. And I'm wondering, like, what do you think about that? Do you feel like there should be around the same number of players elected per era?
I've never thought of it that way, to be honest with you. I've never thought, okay, we have to get these players from this era. I mostly, that's why I think adjusted OPS plus is such an important number, because it gives you what the player's done relative to the rest of the league. And as I say, I think that there are players who suffer under the advanced metrics who, in the context of their times, I gave the example of the middle of the order hitters feeling that it was their job, literally they're gunning for RBI, which have been totally discredited by every team in baseball now in terms of putting teams together. And that's why I think that when you saw Dawson, you saw Rice, I don't think it was as much about we need to get players in from the 70s and 80s. It was how good were they relative to where they were in their sport. And again, that's why I think part of my research in looking at Hall of Famers is to go back and look at salaries and who was paid what and who was valued what as a free agent, who was sought after in trade conversations, because that gives you a present day sense of how that player is viewed in the sport. And as I say, now the idea that you would have a guy like Dawson with a 323 on base percentage and would value him as a Hall of Famer would be ridiculous. Right or wrong, that's how the game was played. And that's why when, and I say this with all due respect, when you talk about players who weren't as good as they were in different eras, it's hard to say that. It's hard for me to necessarily believe that per se, because I just think the game was played differently. And because of what was valued in that time and what was asked of someone like Dawson, Rice. When Eddie Murray took batting practice with the Orioles, he specifically, last round, asked the batting practice pitcher to throw pitches off the corner of the plate because he wanted to practice putting the ball in play when there was a guy at third base. And Mike Flanagan, it was his teammate, told me it was the most ugly batting practice in the world, but that's what he was trying to do. Now, Billy Beane will tell you today, that's crazy. Take the walk, pass the baton down the line. But that's how the game was played. That's why I have a difficult time with saying that there weren't as many good players in a certain time. But I've never looked at it saying we need to get a certain number of players from the 70s and 80s. I really look at the players relative to their era, if that makes sense.
That is all we have time for. Buster Olney, Peter King, Dean Oliver, thank you very much.